All right, y'all. So we are going to talk about the nutrition of our protists today. And you can follow along in your book if you want. I'll be on page 137. So talking about our nutrition, this is basically how we're wondering, okay, how are they getting energy, these protists? Some of them, it is through eating other protists. Some of them, which would make them consumers, okay, if they're eating other protists, some can eat bacteria, and some eat literally whatever floating debris is in their way, which again, yes, is kind of gross. But then again, others of them can make their own food through photosynthesis. They can absorb light and nutrients and eating things through that way as well. So when they eat food, when they get their own source of food, when they're eating it through, eating other bacteria or floating debris, this is consumers, okay? They have to go out, they have to get their food. If you remember when I showed you the picture of what a paramecium looks like, this paramecium, you can go back a couple slides and see this, has something called an oral groove in its mouth. And if you look at page 137, you can actually see this happening, which is pretty weird and cool and all gross at the same time. But this groove is lined with cilia. Remember the short hair? It's lined with this cilia, and it'll sweep food through that opening in that oral groove, okay? It'll trap food in that pocket that forms a hole in their cell membranes, and this is where they hold that food that it's trapped. And then it'll pinch off the membrane towards the inside, and it'll form food vacuoles. And if you remember what a vacuole is, it stores food and waste. And then the paramecium that has these food vacuoles at the inside in these oral grooves, they can also form them other places. But once the food has been engulfed, now we start the digestion process through this. They can form these invaginations are the same thing as oral groove. You don't need to know this fancy word here. You can just call it an oral groove. And then a food vacuole where it stores trapped food. That's totally fine. But once the digested materials will diffuse through the membrane of that vacuole and eventually go into the cytoplasm. And then it will remain in the vacuole. The waste that are not able to be digested will remain inside the vacuole, and then eventually it'll end up outside of the cell. So amoebas, which are a little bit different than parameciums, do not have the permanent food opening. Like, excuse my neighbor, I'm outside, and she always yells at her dogs. If you heard that, I'm sorry. Anyways, amoebas, which are a little bit different than parameciums, they don't have that permanent food opening, so they literally will just surround and engulf their food and with their movement of being an amoeba. Like, they don't have that oral groove in their mouth. It's like they literally, like, if you were to watch it, it almost looks like they just like jump on top of their food slowly, and that's how they engulf it. Protists that perform photosynthesis, because if they're not consumers, then they're producers, right? Remember, we did have a chapter on this. So if they're performing photosynthesis, making their own food, then they are a producer, and they can do this through form of sugars. The type of protist that'll use photosynthesis the most is algae. Again, I'm not going to get super in detail about algae, but this is just usually the plant type of protist that scientists will classify algae as a plant protist. Okay, moving on, let's talk about how they reproduce. I mentioned it very briefly that reproduction in protists can be like every other type of kingdom that we have. They can reproduce in so many different ways. They can reproduce asexually by mitosis. Because under normal conditions, some of them, like amoebas, can divide every 3 days. But some protists can also reproduce sexually. So it just depends. Their gametes form and fuse together. And then another type is conjugation. And you've already read a little bit about conjugation, but this is basically just, if you look on page 138, you can see a picture of it. I've already showed you a picture of it because We've talked about this before when we talked about things reproducing. Paramecium basically just splits in two. It's the oral grooves in the paramecium will exchange DNA, and then when that after the exchanges happen, the two paramecium will just separate. So basically, that's what's happening in reproduction. So why are protists important? Okay, even though they're small, they are important to many other organisms because the most vital protists that we have are in the ocean, and that's called plankton. Okay, and the reason it's so important is you think about it, it's the food source for most animals that are in the ocean. That's what they're going to eat. And you guys know what plankton are. I'm sure you've seen it. The tiny organisms that float near the Earth's surface. Directly the plankton is the food source for most of those ocean animals. Also, it's when these protists are using photosynthesis or being producers, it's a vital part of oxygen, a source of oxygen for us. Because as they're going through that photosynthesis, oxygen is being released as a byproduct. So, and if you remember, when we talked about photosynthesis, we had those competitions where you had to label it in order, and oxygen was a byproduct. You guys did pretty good about that. But there are other things that protists are good for too. You can find it. These are just some economical uses that we use it for. Food sources. Okay, you can find it in toothpaste, a thickener for ice cream. Okay, there are all kinds of good things economically that we need protists for. But you have to understand that with that, there are also some bad reasons for protists as well. There are some of them cause diseases, and I'm talking like not good diseases like malaria, dysentery, a lot of things that can cause death in a lot of other countries, especially if there's not a lot of medical attention. Can cause. I mean, these are very sickening diseases. So they can do a lot of things. Some protists can get inside the body. There can be an ocean when ocean conditions are just right. There is a type of protist that can overpopulate the ocean, and when it does this, it gives a red color to the ocean, and you may have heard it called red tides, which is deadly. It's deadly to fish because of the toxin that's being produced. But when certain types of fish, after a red tide, shellfish in particular, these shellfish during the red tide are poisonous to humans because of the concentration of toxin in their bodies. When my brother went to Israel, he said it was red tide in one of the oceans they saw there, and so he said it was pretty sad they couldn't get in. But just so there are examples of, hey, the bad things and the good things of protists, but it's kind of the same thing as when we talked about bacteria. There's good and bad uses for both. And just like with viruses, people trying to use viruses in a good way, I don't think there's anything wrong with people trying to figure out, hey, how can we use something that's bad for good? I think that's great, but again, we have to consider not just the outcome, not just the good that things cause, but hey, what was the process along the way? Was it harmful to people? Did, the end cannot justify what goes on in the process. So again, make sure you've read through chapter 7, especially all on protists, because we are going to move to fungi next week. If you have any questions, please make sure you have emailed me.